Most early historical testimony ascribes the Gospel of Matthew to Matthew. Modern doubts of Matthaean authorship are the product of hypotheses developed to explain the Synoptic Problem, but these hypotheses cannot alter the testimony of the early Church, whose writers quoted this Gospel more frequently than any other. The Synoptic Problem is the question of the specific literary relationship among the three Synoptic Gospels, that is, the question as to the source or sources upon which each Synoptic Gospel depended when it was written. As a former tax-gatherer, Matthew was well qualified to produce such a Gospel. His business knowledge of shorthand enabled him to record fully the discourses of Jesus. His acquaintance with figures is reflected in his frequent mention of money, his interest in large sums, and his interest in statistics. The great frequency of citations and allusions to Matthew found in the Didache, Epistle of Barnabas, Ignatius, Justin Martyr, and others attests its early composition and widespread use. The literary connections of this Gospel must be considered in its relations to the other synoptics, and also to the statement of Papias, that Matthew wrote the words in the Hebrew dialect, and each one interpreted as he could, according to Eusebius' Ecclesiastical History. The church history of Eusebius, the bishop of Caesarea, was a 4th-century pioneer work giving a chronological account of the development of early Christianity from the 1st century to the 4th century. It was written in Koine Greek, and survives also in Latin, Syriac and Armenian manuscripts. Many have explained Papias' statement as referring to an Aramaic original from which our Greek Gospel is a translation. Yet our Greek text does not bear the marks of a translation, and the absence of any trace of an Aramaic original casts grave doubts upon this hypothesis. Though it is surely possible that Mark was written first, and may have been available to Matthew, there was no slavish use of this shorter Gospel by Matthew, and many have argued for the complete independence of the two books. The date of Matthew's Gospel must be prior to AD 70, for there is no hint in it that Jerusalem was in ruins. AALL predictions of its destruction being clearly prophetic. Such passages as 27 verse 8 that use the phrase, unto this day, and chapter 28 verse 15 that says, until this day, argue for an interval of some length, but 15 or 20 years following the resurrection would be sufficient. The testimony of Irenaeus and Origen that Matthew was written for converts from Judaism is corroborated by a study its content. There is more frequent use of the Old Testament. Much attention is given to demonstrating that Jesus fulfilled messianic prophecy and thus was Israel's Messiah, who would establish the promised kingdom. The discourses that Matthew records at length distinguish this gospel, and emphasize the principles, scope, and movements of the messianic kingdom. Thus Jewish Christians, who numbered in the thousands in the early church, were given an authoritative explanation that faith in Jesus involved no repudiation of the Old Testament, but was the very goal toward which Old Testament revelation pointed. Of course, these same questions faced Gentile converts in proportion to their understanding of the Old Testament. And therefore Matthew's Gospel occupies a place in Christian thinking which quite justifies its position as the first Gospel in our New Testament. Matthew was apparently designed for the instruction of new Christian converts. There is a clear arrangement of the teaching of Jesus in 5 books, perhaps influenced by the 5 books of Moses. The first of these discourses is the famous Sermon on the Mount, on the theme of discipleship. The second is on the theme of mission or apostleship, when the 12 were sent forth to preach and heal. The third discourse is on the parables of the kingdom. The fourth is on the discipline and fellowship of the church. The fifth is the great apocalyptic discourse on the end of the world. Throughout the entire Gospel, narrative is interspersed with teaching, so that each of the 5 books has a narrative section and a teaching section. This was designed for teaching new converts the most important deeds and words of Jesus. Another important aspect of the Gospel of Matthew is that it is clearly aimed at Jews, or converts to Judaism. We know this because he bases every appeal upon the witness of the Old Testament. There are more than 100 allusions to or quotations from the Old Testament. Like a regular refrain, we hear the words, in order that it might be fulfilled, as it was spoken by the prophet. At every point in the ministry of Jesus, Matthew finds the Old Testament text which throws light upon the event, or which finds its spiritual fulfillment in the life of Jesus. Matthew is also very concerned to present Jesus as the son of David. In the first chapter he divides the genealogy of Jesus into 3 parts. 1. From Abraham to David. 2. From David to the exile. And 3. From the exile to the Son of David, Jesus the Christ. Moreover, he carefully arranges the generations in each of the three groups so that they number 14. Not only is this an especially sacred number, because it is twice 7 or Sabbath, but, more important, it is the numerical equivalent to the name of David, the great king. That is, the Hebrew letters which spell the name of David, and which also stand for numbers in Hebrew, add up to 14. This intricate arrangement of the genealogical table can hardly be accidental. It is Matthew's way of emphasizing that Jesus is the promised son of David, fulfilling the messianic prophecies. Such is the great theological theme of the Gospel of Matthew: Jesus is the son of David, the promised Messiah of the Hebrews, who came to bring the kingdom of God. He was rejected by his own people and crucified as the King of the Jews. Wherever Matthew is read, one thing is clear: the Old Testament points to Christ, all the law and the prophets find their fulfillment in him.